Hi, this is Steve Treimer at the State Hygienic Laboratory at the University of Iowa. I'm now Chemical Threat Coordinator, Chemical Safety and Hygiene Officer. Formerly, my role was Emergency Response Chemist, part of the Chemical Threat Response Program. We receive funding from the CDC. It gets passed through our Department of Public Health. The Public Health Lab kind of lies right in the middle of Homeland Security and Emergency Response and Hazmat. So we receive these samples, and I wanted to talk about 3 interesting cases we had this year that hopefully I can provide some insight as to how we can do the job just a little bit better, and maybe provide training in the future hands-on with each of the hazmat teams that we work with so that we can always do a good job with figuring out what these unknown samples are. Most important part of my role since I became a coordinator now is communication. I feel like I've been on the phone more this year with my partners than I ever have, between phone calls, texts, and emails. Homeland Security, I'll present this slide again. Most important part I want to offer everybody is the right phone numbers to use them often if you can. Communication with all of our partners is really important. Homeland Security, Iowa Department of Public Health, and SHL's duty officer is the first number. I have a colleague that is bioterrorism preparedness. He and I share this second number, the 325-0766 number. We'll always respond to that number personally. That will be either me or Drew Ferrum. And he and I work closely together now. We never had split coordinator positions. It was always handled by one person in the past, but now we're trying to focus our efforts either chemistry-wise or biological threat-wise. Several other very important phone numbers that I seem to call more frequently is obviously our civil support team, postal inspection service, and the crime lab, especially in the era of fentanyls and the opioids, has been my partner a lot more in the last 3 or 4 years, and I'm very thankful for having them. They kind of guide me through the process of what samples should I actually be working with and what should I be forwarding directly to them. Obviously, a lot of these calls, the first person that gets them is law enforcement, and so we really need to partner and collaborate with the law enforcement officers on scene as to exactly the forensic nature of this evidence. So it's nice having that crime lab number handy for when these samples come in, and making sure that we treat the evidence appropriately. Poison Control Center, we've had more interaction with them, and we'll talk specifically about a couple cases in our FBI field office over in Omaha. It's too bad we have to call and work on these as much as we have, but it's good to know we have a good partnership with all of the responding agencies. We still have the guiding protocol for CBRNE threats from 2007. This is a very busy slide. I hope to simplify that significantly. My goal, to be honest with you, is have a single sheet of paper laminated and basically have 2 sides of information, and that be what we need. The most important part is we need documentation and communication, but we also need law enforcement needs to participate in assigning a threat level to all of these incidents. That helps us tremendously, not just when we receive the sample, but when we start requesting help from our other partners, such as the civil support team and the FBI. We all need to understand exactly the background of the information, the background of the sample, to help figure out exactly how much of a threat we might be dealing with. This form is one of the forms that the State Hygienic Lab put together quite a few years ago. It is a busy slide. I can't imagine how long it actually takes to fill out all of this information in these boxes. And I'm happy to send these carbon copied forms to anybody who wants them. Just contact me. Hopefully this presentation will be available to you afterwards. My email address is obviously available, and you can call the lab and you can find us on the internet really easily. I'll send you as many as you want if you want this form, but I'll be honest with you, a simple spiral pad kept by the hazmat teams or law enforcement, and just take a a cell phone picture of it and send me your notes. Obviously, if you don't want to send me the actual piece of paper you have, or bring the piece of paper in with your sample, and I'll be happy to make a photocopy and give you back the original. Just give me some documentation of what has been done in the field. The center section here is a field test, and that's the most important thing that I need to know as a chemist or as a scientist starting to work on this sample. Obviously, patient exposures is really important as well. That's kind of how our lab triages the significance of the sample. If it's a biological threat, we almost never see signs and symptoms with immediate onset, whereas if it's more of a chemical threat, we'll obviously see those signs and symptoms very quickly. The three samples I'm going to talk about today are all chemical related. I don't have any real good stories of biological threats that we received this year to share with you, but hopefully my partner Drew will present those to our hazmat teams throughout the year as well, as those come in. But give us the information, as much information as you possibly can. That's all I ask is, and we create a file, and that file is part of our after action report and also part of the report that we'll give back to the responding agencies as part of our analysis, our chemical and biological analysis of the sample that you give us. So it just helps tidy up the loose ends, especially if people later down the road are asking questions about what everybody saw, especially out in the field. Chain of custody is really important. We almost never see this from hazmat teams. Again, this is one that we created internally. It's carbon copied. Usually we need more signature fields than this, and we'll have to create additional copies. But again, this is really agency specific. The main point is if law enforcement wants to potentially treat this sample as forensic evidence, or if it might become a case in the future, we really need to have a chain of custody to help solidify a case for our law enforcement. And the crime lab especially appreciates this, especially if any of these samples might potentially contain opioids or fentanyl compounds that may be prosecuted in the future. So what can you expect from us when you do bring us a sample, or when you at least get me on the phone or Drew on the phone to talk about what you're seeing out on the scene? We're immediately gonna, if anything's a credible threat or anything interesting at all, the civil support team is a real good partner for us, and they usually keep track of intel that's going around the country. The most important thing is just to send them a heads up. It doesn't hurt to over communicate. I've never heard anybody upset about getting too much information. So I've made a concerted effort to try and call them on every sample that we get in that's interesting, just in case they may be seeing a pattern on their end as well. They may or may not advise us to get the FBI involved, depending on the nature of it. Anything that's mail related, we've got to have the Pulse Inspection Service involved. Again, their phone number is different than I found in the CBRNE Protocol from 2007. They've got a new emergency response number, and they've got a duty officer that takes care of that number in real time as well. So it's really important to keep them involved on anything mail related whatsoever. And again, they have a lot of intel and pattern recognition as well, based on things that are happening around their region. Crime lab supervisor, as I discussed before, IDPH and poison control. And then most importantly, we'll meet you at our laboratory at any hour of the day, as you're gonna soon find out, to receive that sample and either process it immediately based on the nature of the incident, especially if there's a patient that's exposed adversely, or we'll triage it and put it in our normal sample queue if it's not as high of a credible threat, but it's still a significant problem, such as an economic issue or a business was shut down from a potential mailing is a good example. So being a scientist, give you kind of an example of what I look like in the lab today, now worrying about fentanyls and these all hazard responses. This is a chemist named Emily with the DEA crime lab. She's working with a fentanyl powder there. I don't work with anything out in the open anymore. Obviously, they've got a lot of experience in their cleanup procedures. She's got a lot of PPE on, and that's really important. And that's also what I really want my first responders to start thinking about as well. COVID-19 has helped out quite a bit with our respiratory protection, but formerly we typically would work with these unknown powders out in the open, and we wouldn't really think about respirators too much, and maybe not even safety glasses. But as we move forward, I think we need to do a lot better job of protecting ourselves from especially these fentanyls and these opioids. They can't absorb through the skin unless they're dissolved, which obviously they're typically not, but skin absorption typically isn't an issue, but respiratory obviously is, or inhalation and even getting into those mucous membranes. That's the real problem. And we've heard stories about people out on the scene having a wind come by and blow that powder around and getting some sort of an exposure that way. So really focus, and especially as COVID starts to disappear, please consider to continue wearing some sort of respiratory protection. And again, you really need to choose the appropriate respirator protection as well. In the lab, I don't use these N95 masks. I'm more like these individuals. Certainly, I'm not in these types of level A suits that you see here, but I do wear a half mask respirator now. That's what I'm approved to wear. And I do work with everything in the hood. This is a biological safety hood, whereas I'm typically working in a chemical fume hood. But just to give you an example of more how I treat these samples, especially the one that we'll talk about in the next slide. Christmas Eve, thankfully we were coming home. We got a call from a hazmat team, which was really helpful. They called me right out in the field as they found a white powder at a grave site, crystalline material, a significant amount of powder as well, but they had a human exposure. And that is pretty rare for our laboratory to actually have a human exposure with an adverse reaction and an immediate adverse reaction. This person actually chose to taste the sample that they found at this grave site, which obviously everybody knows is a bad idea, but hard to say why somebody would choose to try and identify it that way. Unfortunately, the patient quickly had a medical condition. Eventually EMS was called, and EMS protected the patient's airway and intubated the victim and flew them into the local hospital, which is really rare for that to happen and for us to get a sample of this magnitude. And honestly, this is an example of why the entire chemical threat program was created with our laboratory in the first place. So we received the sample. Well, I guess I've got another slide later, but we received that sample that night on Christmas Eve. I met the hazmat tech with the sample, and we received the real-time information directly from the technician. We didn't have any hard notes that were given to us or any forms, but my associate director was with me, so both he and I asked enough questions that we could get started on it. We triaged that sample as being primarily chemical. We treat it as obviously an all hazards, having a patient have that kind of a negative reaction. But I was curious of how much an actual taste is, and I moistened my finger in the laboratory. Again, I didn't taste my finger, or I didn't lick my finger, but just moistened it and touched the powder, and it comes out to be about 137 milligrams. Again, different people, different fingers, different compounds weigh a different amount and everything, but it's just interesting to see how much that actually is. I was surprised that that much material can actually be picked up just from a finger touch like that. So when you start thinking about toxicology and poisons, you start having to worry about milligrams per kilogram of body weight, and that's where you start trying to wrap your head around, well, what could that chemical possibly be that could be that toxic? We've seen these slides before of what is a lethal dose. And again, the main point with toxicology is every person's body responds to a chemical slightly differently. And this case is a real good example of that. Hopefully I'll show you when we talk about the outcomes of this case. But from a generic standpoint, we think of, apologize, my mouse is very sensitive. We think of heroin as a lethal dose, as that's an easily accessible amount. That's probably more than obviously you saw on my fingertip there, but the fentanyl certainly is much less than you see on my fingertip there. And carfentanil, that typically was initially used as an anesthetic for very large animals, very heavy, large body mass, large blood volumes. You're talking about dissolving that small amount in a very large volume of liquid or a large mass of body. So it's a very potent version of an opioid. I have not come across carfentanil in my career yet, but the crime lab has. And thankfully, those samples have all gone directly to that crime lab. This is another slide very similar to the previous one where we show therapeutic doses. This is what people are trying to use to feel good versus the fatal doses. And you get a perspective of how little a fatal dose can be with these really potent opioids. Ibuprofen as an example. I apologize. Ibuprofen, for an example, much less toxic and not nearly, it takes far more material to actually cause a significant reaction like we were seeing. This is the actual sample the hazmat tech brought to me. Very well might be the most sample I've ever received, which in itself is intelligence information right there. That's a large amount of material. That is a 50 milliliter plastic falcon tube. And I don't know, there must have been maybe 10 to 20 grams of material that were provided to me. That's a very, and he actually had another tube, maybe not quite as much material as it is as this, but typically your really lethal chemicals, you don't have that much material available to you, and you treat it a little more judiciously, and you do a much more targeted application to cause harm to your victim. So that kind of de-escalated the situation as far as a laboratorian or as a scientist in the laboratory. But again, we don't know what else might be dissolved in this large amount of matrix, as we refer to it as. You know, you very well could have a very small amount of a poison. Obviously, you can think of rat poisons that could be concentrated and added into there. You could think of pesticides, organophosphates, et cetera, that could be mixed in with there. And they're using this bulk material just to mask what is really the poison that's causing the harm. So we always have to worry about that. And we try to do our efforts here in the lab to separate those things out. On scene information, obviously I talked about that already. We had a victim with immediate onset of adverse reactions. The technician told me that their FTIR was inconclusive, and that's a very accurate statement. This technician was terrific, and I will say absolutely nothing bad about how they did their job. It was fantastic. I do believe that tech also did an instrument check, which is a small plastic wafer that they run and make sure that they get a good spectrum and it gets a good library match. They found that it was very soluble in water out in the field and pH was neutral, and an oxidizer test was attempted and was inconclusive. Now, as I understand the SOGs from our hazmat teams, they don't test this type of reaction, the oxidizer test, with some sort of a check oxidizer to make sure that their readings are working and are appropriate. So that may be something that we'll try to address in the future by helping train them on how to, you know, we'll find some sort of a safe oxidizer that they can work with and just to check to make sure that those tests in the field are accurate and are working properly in real time. That was all the information I got. So obviously the first thing I do is I try to repeat all the information I don't have. Johnson County Hazmat was terrific in supplying me one of their old 4-gas meters this is a good quick check on a sample to see whether or not it's off-gassing. Obviously, a solid like that probably is not going to be off-gassing. Even something that has a lot of smell, like you think of naphthalene, which are mothballs, the actual amount of chemical vapor coming off of that, even though we can smell it, is not very much and probably would not register on this meter. It's really most appropriate for liquids and obviously gases. But it's part of our standard operating procedure to check. I apologize. Radiologicals is really important as well. We have a meter here that it's called an identifier. If I don't have any information from the field as far as whether or not they check for radiologicals, I have to run it on this instrument as well. The problem with this is it's really only a gamma meter. And obviously there are a lot of radiologicals that have other types of emissions. We've heard of poisonings that have been done around the world right now with things that are called alpha emitters and are extremely toxic. But again, we're talking about a patient that was showing immediate signs and symptoms. So we're not really going down that road as far as radiological health effects, because obviously there would be a much larger situation involved if that was the case. As soon as I can perform all those safety checks, unfortunately, the one check I can't really do is whether or not the sample is explosive. I've got to work on trying to figure out how I can put together a kit or have some sort of an SOP for doing that safely in the laboratory. I'm not even sure how easily that can be tested by the hazmat teams out in the field. We're not supposed to receive any explosives in the laboratory for obvious reasons, but again, how do you know? That's the real challenge that I have. But again, that macro amount of solid that was in that tube, probably based on the appearance of it, and it clearly not off-gassing. ANFO is an ammonium nitrate fuel oil bomb. Obviously, it's been in the news quite a bit in the last 10 years, but that mixture there didn't appear to have any off-gassing of any fuel-related compounds. So that's, again, a good part of intel. The solid substance is your oxidizer, the thing that supplies the oxygen to the fuel to really cause the reaction to go. And that's the oxidizer itself isn't what we consider to be explosive. It needs a combination of fuel. So I felt confident that I could try and run the sample on our FTIR instrument, which is a little bit more research-based and laboratory-based than what they have in the field. I've got an extensive amount of libraries that I can search with this instrument. This also has a Raman attachment to it, which I'll talk about later. Raman works very well for samples that may or may not have water present. And so the two tools that you see on that bench and along with the microscope really help us do a lot of work with unknown solids that come in from the field. Unfortunately, we've had to implement having a naloxone rescue kit on hand at all times. The Iowa Harm Reduction Coalition has supplied us these kits along with training as far as how to administer those. Should I, as a scientist, be working with this sample and my sentry outside the door observe me collapse, we can implement this naloxone kit right away. We've obviously got to check expiration dates on those and keep them current, but the point is we keep them on hand for worst case scenarios, and we provide on the spot training for people that need it, but it's also part of our safety committee now that people have gotten this training. It's unfortunate that we've had to go that way, but thank goodness we've got the Harm Reduction Coalition to help us with providing those kits to us and a lot of other agencies around the state right now. And that's administered through the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics. As I was alluding to before, anytime I'm trying to do a chemical analysis, I hope that my responders in the field will do the exact same thing that I'm doing. I want to make sure my instrument's working properly. So I'm going to test my instrument on a polyethylene fiber, make sure that I'm seeing what I call our chemical peaks. And I'm not sure if you can see my cursor here. Again, I'll try to be gentle. But we see these peaks here, and they're somewhat broad, I would call them, but those are real chemical peaks, and those come from the organic bonds in a molecule. And I apologize if this isn't the right audience, but again, I'm trying to bring this hazmat chemistry perspective into our Homeland Security response. And we'll leave it at that. I won't get too deep, but we want to see these unique peaks, and it doesn't look like it's noise. It looks like those should be there. I never rely on just a single check. I'll also try a solvent, for example, isopropyl alcohol. We get different peaks, but again, they look good, and we see this nice broad peak here, and we'll see that in a lot of samples. And that's usually either an alcohol or due to water, which water has that OH, similar to other alcohols. This was the actual sample that I received, and there are two really important parts here. Again, this really broad peak you see here, and this peak in the middle here, I've seen this a lot of times, and we'll talk about that soon. But over here on this side as well is what is the actual signal intensity from the sample, and it's very low. You look at those numbers, and it's very, very low. For reference, immediately before running that, I ran isopropyl alcohol, and you can see that those numbers are at least 10 times lower with the actual sample. Inorganic samples typically don't work well on FTIR. And there's nothing wrong, it's just not the appropriate instrument for running that type of sample. I always jokingly told all my colleagues throughout the years, I said the worst sample I would ever get into my laboratory, in my organic laboratory, is table salt, sodium chloride, because there are no chemical bonds there that I can work with. And everybody kind of thought that was unusual because, you know, table salt should be easy as pie to identify, right? Well, believe it or not, table salt really isn't very easy to identify. For me, I have to use my partner over in Ankeny. We have a chemist out there that handles inorganic analysis, and that's where all of our inorganic analyses are done for the lab. So I use him frequently, and Brian is my colleague over there. He got a call on Christmas Eve as well. So show you this example. This is how I do a library search for the actual sample. On the top is a spectrum of water run by this, and the green line is the unknown sample. And you'll notice that those peaks that we're seeing are almost perfectly matched up. Well, obviously that sample was solid and it wasn't water, which is liquid. So obviously that's not it, but why are we seeing water as the only signal? Well, again, the signal was very, very low, and that's all we're seeing. And that's an important feature. And that's just something that I want to point out, that this instrument probably isn't the right one for what we're observing there. And that started leading us down to the path of this material that was brought to us was probably an inorganic salt of some sort. Briefly reiterate some of the things that I did in my laboratory there. We checked RADs. Solubility in water is important, but I also check it to see if there's any solubility in any of my common organic solvents that we typically use in the lab. I check pH with a variety of different strips to see if it's acidic, basic. Perform an oxidizer test, very similar to what our hazmat techs do out in the field, but I do run that against a known oxidizer material that I have in the lab as well to make sure that what I'm seeing is working. Finally, this DPH test, if I'm thinking that I might be working with a bleach of some sort of hypochlorite in particular, we've got a little dye compound that we can run real quickly to see whether or not it might be something like a pool shock, which people have used in the past to try and harm others. We got a negative result on that DPH test, so it wasn't a hypochlorite salt. So again, we spent a couple hours trying to figure out what this could possibly be. Believe it or not, 10:30 at night, while parents were starting to put out presents under a tree, I was on a phone call, and this had never happened before either, but the Department of Public Health got involved, and they were very concerned about this patient. Clearly the signs and symptoms were real, and they wanted to try and identify what it was. They wanted to know all of the background information, and some of that I did not have, but they followed up directly with the hazmat tech And this was the first time I had seen this picture, and the hazmat tech agreed to share the screen with them. And this is what the FTIR result looked like out in the field. And again, there's nothing wrong with what we're seeing here. The hazmat tech interpreted it correctly, and I'm zooming in just a little bit. The pink trace is the actual sample, and the blue trace is the very first entry in their library search. What I want you to focus on are these peaks in the middle. Those are really sharp. Those aren't really like the chemical peaks that we see in a normal FTIR. These are way too sharp. These are what you typically find from noise, from electronic noise, or more specifically, detector noise. These are so sharp that, and it occurs when you really start to zoom in on a baseline. As we'll see here, you look on the left there, those numbers are extremely small, and those are the numbers that correspond to the pink trace, the actual sample. Those are very, very small numbers, and what's happened is the instrument has zoomed in because there's not a lot of signal there, so it's showing you the zoomed in baseline of that. The bad part with these instruments, and these instruments came out around the time of 2003 to 4 to 5, they're all governed by a computer algorithm search routine. And unfortunately, no matter what, the computer is going to spit out a number, or it's going to perform some sort of a search, and it's going to try to compare what the pink trace is to what it's got in its library. The most important thing we have to do as scientists and hazmat techs is say, do these things match up at all? And the tech in the field agreed that this was a bad number. These numbers should never even be shown if they're less than 0.8 or 0.9. A perfect matching score is a 1. We almost never see that, but it's got to be at least an 80% or 90% or higher match. Otherwise, it's really not credible. And the hazmat tech was terrific. He knew that right away. Unfortunately, we got called into question of whether or not this could possibly be one of these compounds that are listed here. And these are all organic compounds, hydrazine. These are really good fuels, to be honest with you. So the very next day, we sent the sample. We sent part of that sample over to Ankeny because my boss and I were both convinced it was more of an inorganic salt. This is the type of instrument that they have that will actually tell what kind of an anion is. Is it a chloride, a nitrate, or a sulfate, or et cetera? But unfortunately, there's no instrument on Earth that gives you the entire picture with just one shot. So in order to figure out what the cation is, the metal of that salt, sodium, potassium, calcium, et cetera, they have to run it on this instrument as well. And these are very fast instruments, and when they've been calibrated and checked out, they work really wonderfully. But again, I don't have those at my disposal. We have to take that over to Ankeny. That ICP-MS instrument that you see right there, very sophisticated, it will actually identify all of the elements that you see in color on this chart here. It's a very impressive instrument. It's just as impressive as the organic-based instruments we have over here in Coralville. Brian was quickly able to identify chloride in that sample, and soon after, he was able to identify sodium in that sample, and based on the ratio of the mass he'd weighed out and what he was seeing from his calibrated response here, he was pretty sure that what we call it the stoichiometry was coming out to be sodium chloride. So that was his expert analysis. At the same time, me and another colleague used 2 different instruments in our lab to try and identify if there could have been any organic material mixed in with that salt that we see there, whether or not it could be what I was referring to before, like an ANFO type bomb. We saw absolutely nothing. These flatline traces are actual solutions that I took, and we saw absolutely nothing from all 3 of the instruments. This one you see a little bit of stuff coming off. My colleague showed it there, but really this is just part of the column bleed of the instrument. What's interesting is is out here at the higher time frames. There's absolutely nothing in those samples. We do instrument checks on those GCMSs as well. This is a common pesticide mixture. And again, you see real normal peaks that come out well above the baseline. And we didn't see any of that in the sample. So what's the final outcome? Well, it's the first time that I've ever had to give, the only report I could give was we've identified sodium chloride. We have no idea why the patient responded like they did. I even had to explain it to the sheriff of the county that family was very concerned with and wanted an investigation done. And believe me, I'm an EMT as well, and as a chemist here, nothing would make me more proud than to identify exactly what it was that caused this patient to respond the way they did, and especially when you consider the cost of a helicopter flight is at least $10,000. I've even heard them being significantly higher than that. And so we certainly don't want to minimize what that patient had gone through, but unfortunately, our answer on this entire analysis, all of the man hours involved, was sodium chloride. So we'll move on. Looks like I've got about another 15 to 20 minutes to talk here. Chemical threat 2, trucking company was closed. So this was a huge economic threat, and we've seen this a lot throughout the 15 years, 17 years I've been doing this job. A mail envelope contains a powder. So again, the immediate law enforcement, when they get called, and the hazmat team as well, you've got to get the postal inspection service involved immediately on this. I actually heard this situation on the radio driving into work, and obviously your ears get tuned into hearing this right away, and so I thought, well, they already reopened up the business. The FTIR that they used got a hit for vitamin B. So we did receive this sample, which again, we try to reinforce for any sample that a hazmat team needs to know an answer to. We are happy to run those free of charge, and we'll run them as quickly as we possibly can. The hazmat team actually had access to a Raman instrument from the police department as well. Those have been used a lot for on-scene narcotics identifications. And this was really nice that they had 2 pieces of information, or 2 pieces of instrumentation to use at their disposal. But again, as we'll talk about here, this is a screenshot of the sample itself that I received from the tech when they gave me the sample. And again, we've talked about this before. The most important part here is the pink trace there is our actual sample, and the blue line is what the instrument did a computer search for and threw out an answer for. Again, you have to really look at that, and there is no feature on that at all that tells me that those are chemical peaks at all. Certainly nothing that I've ever seen before. And there's actually a couple ways that this can happen on an instrument. And I've seen it before where if a material is stuck onto the stage that didn't get wiped off or rinsed off well, what happens is the instrument will actually take its background reading with the material stuck on the stage. And then when you go to put your sample onto the stage, well, it's already got that material already stuck there on the stage. And so the instrument runs the exact same spectrum of what's stuck on the stage, and it essentially gives you a flat line. And that's what we're seeing here, is a flat line. Now, I have no idea if that's what happened here. The problem is I wasn't given any information on whether or not they did any performance checks out in the field to make sure that the instrument was working. That's the only way you can tell whether or not you're running the instrument correctly, is if you run some sort of a quality control out in the field, like that polyethylene wafer, every time you run the instrument. We weren't given any of that information, unfortunately, so I can only advise on how we can maybe do it better. But we've got to look over here on the left on the actual signal of the sample, extremely small numbers. So again, we're not getting any response whatsoever. So that's got to tell us we've got to start over, make sure that the lamp in the instrument is actually working, make sure all the performance checks we actually had to do quite a bit of diagnostics at this point to make sure that the instrument's actually working properly before we try to throw a sample on it. The other bad thing that can happen is if you throw your sample on and then you start up the instrument and the instrument says, okay, we're going to take a background reading right now. If you've already put your sample on the stage at that point, the instrument is going to be taking its background reading of your sample, and then that's going to be locked into memory. And when it actually goes to quote unquote run the sample, it's going to subtract the exact same thing that it's in its memory, just like when you put a number into your calculator and store it into memory, same exact way, and it's going to background subtract that away. What I'm frustrated with, and I really want us to start thinking about in the future, is getting away from allowing these software programs just to spit out a number with a poor match like that. And then clearly you can see that there's no reason that those two, I mean, with our naked eye, we would never say that those two traces there have any correlation whatsoever. But unfortunately, that computer program, that mathematical algorithm just goes by and says, oh, we've got a peak here and a peak there. Okay, it's a 57% match. Again, if it's not at least 80, don't make any important decisions based on that information alone. We didn't receive any information on what the Raman instrument had out in the field, which is regrettable. I'm really curious what instrument they used and what readings they got. But again, we've got to run those QC checks. And this entire analysis only takes a couple of minutes. There's no reason we can't run 3 or 4 QC checks to make sure that we're getting really good results. So we took that sample into the laboratory. I don't think I have a picture for it for you. I apologize. It would have been a great picture to show, but I don't think I had very much material to work with. Extremely soluble in water again, no pH. There was very slight solubility in alcohol, which tells me it has some organic nature to it, but insoluble in some of our other organic solvents. So we ran GCMS on it as well. But the most important part is we put this right onto our FTIR, and obviously a clean instrument and with performance checks. And immediately we saw, hopefully I can do this gently, a 98% match with powdered sugar and also wintergreen altoid. If you think about that, that's just sucrose, regular table sugar that's pressed into a pellet form. I mean, that's what you're seeing, is you're seeing the sugar of that altoid. But you compare this from the naked eye and you're like, yeah, there's no question whatsoever that that's sugar. Now, there are some other analyses you can do for sugars if you want to go down that road. But so again, this was an quick, easy identification on our part. But we do try and look at the GCMS as well to see if there's any additional poisons in that could be dissolved in there to try and identify any hidden threats. And that's important for law enforcement as well, because if somebody's really trying to commit attempted murder, I mean, that's really important. And again, we'll do this in conjunction with working with the crime lab, and that's why we try to preserve that evidence as forensically attributable as possible. We submitted it for ICP-MS for metals and for ion chromatography for anions. In this respect, they saw nothing over in Ankeny, so it clearly was not a salt related at all. It was just simple table sugar. And with the last 10 minutes here, we'll talk about this third interesting analysis we got here. This was interesting in the fact that law enforcement and the Postal Inspection Service were involved right away. This was a shipment that was delivered to a hotel here in Iowa City. And the person calling in, or the person being interviewed on scene, had no reason to suspect that these should show up to them at that hotel. So called in police, and since it was a shipment, they also got the Postal Inspection Service. This is the shipping invoice. What's interesting on this invoice that was included with this material is, I don't know if I zoom in on this at all. I hope I do. No, I don't. That says USB cable. So again, this all originated out of China. And I wish I apologize for not zooming in a little bit more on this shipping label for you, but it all originated out of China. And immediately the postal inspector says, yeah, we've been seeing a lot of this. Based on what you're seeing there, that has to be either fentanyl, an opioid, or a steroid, which I thought was interesting, but obviously pretty credible, pretty high threat situations for us. Called the inspection service. They're terrific, and they've got a tremendous wealth of knowledge, and actually their scientists are fantastic out in the field. I've been working with them for 17 years as well, and I have the utmost respect for what they do trying to identify these out in the field as well. But make sure local law enforcement has at least contacted the crime lab in this type of situation. Because if this really is some sort of, I mean, you look at that white substance in the bottom of that vial there, that could be anything. And it certainly could be something of forensic nature. So it's really important to get that crime lab involved. Now, we went ahead and called the crime lab and talked through this situation with them. And this is what we're really worried about here is, again, these coming out of China. You can't see it real well on the slide, but that's kind of a slight yellowish powder. But again, that deals more with purity. A lot of chemicals, when they're refined in high purity like this, I've observed to be white in color. I mean, we call them white powders, but you've got to have really high purity to have an actual white powder. So let's just call it an unknown powder, and that's what we've evolved to. Fortunately, the instrument we have in the laboratory was able to I didn't have to open the vial at all. I have an instrument that will actually shine a laser with enough power, and if you see this little red dot, I can actually look at the vial without even opening it up. And this was a really thick, heavy-walled vial. I didn't have a tremendous amount of signal, but this is a Raman signal, so any of the peaks you see in here are important. So I did this analysis numerous times over the course of an hour or so and was able to get enough power and just enough signal to start matching up some of these peaks to just common glycine, your most basic amino acid. Talked with some of my chemists and my boss here in the laboratory and also our biological folks and said, I think it's, the Raman is telling me it's actually just glycine. And we're getting really not terrific matches. Again, I want to emphasize that this isn't an 80% match. Again, my signal is really small here, but I'm seeing a qualitative comparison where a lot of this stuff is lining up that I'm feeling confident that we're at least on the right track. We want to do background subtraction to see if there's anything else that might be hidden in there. What this means is you subtract away the primary component that you think it is, and you're left with what's called a residual. Well, there was nothing there. And actually, anytime you see these negative peaks there, that's really negative information as far as for the FTIR. So there was nothing else in there. But fortunately, I have a lot of different materials in the laboratory, and we've got glycine. So I was able to actually simulate running the exact same sample. This is a different perspective of that holder, and you see my red dot there. Try to finish this up here in 5 minutes to give you guys some time. But we got a terrific comparison, and that red trace there matched very closely to my original sample as well. Get a lot better match, which I don't really understand because this red trace looked very similar to that original trace from the actual sample itself. So I can overlay these and try to see whether or not those peaks line up, and they do. So at this point, I went ahead and opened those vials and worked with the actual sample itself and ran it on the FTIR stage, obviously running a bunch of quality control checks first as well, but irrefutable matches in all situations. So again, here was the unknown, matched almost, not a perfect match, but much higher. And again, my glycine control that I actually have in-house, very similar in spectra and appearance and everything in there. So the outcome on this one, we called local law enforcement who's still on scene. We said, ask that person if there's any possibility it could be a glycine amino acid. Well, then suddenly that person remembered ordering a bunch of glycine, which is used to stimulate human growth hormone in people who are trying to lift weights and bodybuild. So just an ironic outcome there. And I don't know what else to tell you there, but it is a good partnership between hazmat teams, local law enforcement, and also the crime lab, the Postal Inspection Service, Homeland Security, and the FBI. Thankfully, none of these the FBI did have to get involved with. But in the few minutes I have left, maybe we need to start thinking about helping these 17, 15, maybe 15 teams or so around the state that still have these older hazmat IDs from 2003 and 2004 and 2005. Again, the current WMD teams that we have in Davenport, Des Moines, and Council Bluffs are using this new generation of a combined FTIR and Raman instrument. And the reason we have to plan so far ahead to try and start outfitting our other teams with these is they're very expensive, regrettably expensive. This instrument here, the best quote I could get on a bulk purchase was right at $100,000 each. So I don't know if that's really a viable alternative. I mean, it would take some planning, and maybe we could do it in stages of 2 or 3 teams at a time starting to evolve. But the two techniques are very complementary to each other. They make other types of handheld instruments. The company that made the original Hazmat ID now has this type of an instrument, and it's significantly smaller, has much more libraries, and has advanced quite a bit, has capabilities of pulling and shooting on the side and putting a vial or putting a sample right on a little stage there as well. Obviously, that unit there is much, much less in price, but it does not include that Raman functionality, which does have its place. Thermo makes an equivalent of just that handheld FTIR. These are much less expensive to buy, but again, it's not what our WMD teams have. So do we want to standardize or not? Again, I don't know what kind of budget we could maybe start planning for, writing some grants of some sort, but I'm certainly happy to help teach the teams on a real-time basis, bringing a variety of materials with me and going out on scene and having them work in real time, being protective of their airway, making sure they're wearing their PPE while they're running these tests, but also making sure that they're running those quality control checks before and after every single analysis, before they report a result. This instrument over here, I think, is made by Brooker, and I think that's a handheld Raman instrument as well. So you can buy these as separate tools for less than the cost of this combined tool. And again, we've got Agilent's got a new instrument as well. I can't remember. I think that's just an FTIR instrument. But it's just food for thought that maybe we need to start retiring out those older instrumentation, getting the smaller, newer, more robust instruments that have evolved over the last 15 years, and helping out our teams, especially in our larger cities that rely on these for reopening businesses in real time and stuff. We're nearing the end of my talk. I promise you, this is a slide I stole from my colleague Drew. No laboratorians were harmed, and no safety protocols were violated. I challenge you to count how many violations you see there. That's something we do in the lab here, is take safety very, very important. Finally, I leave you again with a slide of requesting help, reaching out to our collaborators. Don't ever make critical decisions just with your lone agency. There's help, there's resources. Let's work on this teamwork and this collaboration and do it together. I think that reassures the public and minimizes the risk of any one agency tremendously. And I'll leave it to you guys for questions.